When people imagine a dragon, especially in a European context, they picture a fire breathing monster, which faces a hero, usually in a moment of violent confrontation. And this image feels almost natural to us, but it's not something that's universal, it's only culturally produced. And certainly in European culture, dragons are almost always the enemies. And this raises an important question. Why did Europe imagine dragons in this way? And this episode hopes to explore how European dragons would become such symbols of moral evil, excess power, and chaos, rather than being neutral or benevolent creatures. Because it truly, well and truly is a peculiarity how such a creature that is so universal has such different interpretations throughout various cultures, throughout various eras, various continents. It is also worth mentioning what exactly defines a dragon. Now, European dragons are typically large winged reptilian creatures with the ability to breathe fire, making them an unnatural and destructive force spreads its chaos throughout the lands. And they live outside civilization, so in caves, mountains, ruins of old kingdoms, in spaces that can symbolize danger and disorder. They hoard treasure, especially gold, which immediately ties them to this sense of greed and moral corruption. Within the various narratives within which they've embodied their role, they rarely have complexity to them or sympathy. They're particularly one-dimensional. They're evil creatures, and the narrative role is one to be confronted and destroyed, not really nuanced beyond that point. Now, quite similarly to European culture as a whole, the European dragon imagery draws heavily upon ancient Greek and Roman ideas about how the world is. It's a struggle between order and chaos. Serpentine-like monsters are rife in classical myth. They represent the untamed forces that would threaten civilization and the human world. The best examples of this would be the Python of Delphi, which guarded the Oracle of Delphi, slain by Apollo, and therefore Apollo could take his Oracle at Delphi, which he is more famous for, is shown as a symbol of establishing divine order and authority. In fact, the Python was set by a Roman goddess herself, Hera, due to Zeus's infidelity, as is common with Greek mythology. Zeus had an affair with Leto, who was the mother of Apollo and Artemis. And while she was pregnant with the twins, the Python was essentially set to by Hera to chase around Leto while she was pregnant with these two twins. Further to this example of the Python is the Hydra. It's a chaos that multiplies when confronted improperly. When one head is taken off in the wrong way, another one grows in its place. And it reinforces the idea that monsters require heroic intervention. More particularly, it is a labour of Hercules, funnily enough, caused because of Hera being mad at Zeus's constant infidelity, which is, as I said, is a common factor of Greek mythology. And another labour of Hercules is to find the golden apples. The guard, as it would be, is Ladon, another serpentine figure, which guards a divine treasure, which is what it's Hercules, one of his labours to find. And this positions the dragon as sort of an obstacle between humanity and reward. So more particularly, what these stories would establish is a template where the monster exists to be overcome. And dragons later inherit this role. The ancient Greek mythology establishes this role. It later gets transferred over to the ancient Romans, and the ancient Romans go on to colonize most of Western Europe. So with the advent of Christianity in Europe, the dragon would transform from a creature of grave danger into sort of a creature of moral evil. And this is solidified by the sort of story of the serpent in the Garden of Even bloody Stevens. The serpent in the Garden of Eden became the ultimate symbol of temptation and corruption for Christians. And over time, this visualization of the serpent and the dragon is something that would merge in a visual sense and a symbolic sense. The dragon would be the way of describing these beasts and these monsters. And in the book of Revelation, it does explicitly describe Satan as a dragon as well. and it sort of cements this idea of the monster. So it is by the medieval period itself where dragons would no longer be seen as just threats. They also embodied, beyond that, grave actions such as sin, heresy, and evil itself, which for a medieval audience would have been very looked down upon and despised. I did not say despised correctly there. I apologize for that. So more particularly on the medieval period itself, in medieval Europe, there was this idealizing of the knight as this moral and religious defender, not just being a warrior, but having these other aspects to it. And dragons became an ultimate test of virtue and faith for these knights. In the legend of St. George itself, from the age of antiquity in the 3rd century, the dragon terrorizes a community, and it demands human sacrifice from the village when the village has expended all of its livestock and its trinkets. It then offers up a human sacrifice, and the princess is to be sacrificed, and that's where St. George comes in, defeats the dragon through faith, and it leads to the conversion of the population. I think more importantly from this tale, what else we can sort of derive is modern tropes of the dragon, of hoarding gold and saving a damsel in distress. And these are things that we can see in the age of antiquity, which is interesting to see. The fact that these modern tropes also exist in this tale of antiquity, and that they've stayed with it ever since. But more importantly, what the dragon seeks to validate is the hero's righteousness, and reinforcing the medieval worldview of a strict good versus evil battle as a whole. Speaking more on the medieval worldview is the fact that European dragons were almost always portrayed as these hoarders of wealth, especially and more particularly gold. And the hoarding symbolizes their qualities of excess and corruption and unrestrained power. And dragons weren't portrayed as using this wealth productively. They sat on it basically, and rendering it destructive because it led to the fact that there were ruined kingdoms, destroyed cities, and suffering populations because of it. And in this way, dragons became warnings about the dangers of greed and power without moral restraint, not knowing what to do. And one of the things this appealed to as well is in the age of colonization was the idea of terra nullius, which was an idea put forward by the Spanish and later adopted by the British when they were colonizing North America. It was the idea that the natives of these American lands weren't using the land properly, and therefore it led to the justification of colonization. Now, obviously, this was contradictory because the Native Americans had more of an idea of how to till the land and how to treat it than the invading British and Spanish. And all the European societies did was spread around their measles and the smallpox and their diseases, wiping out these civilizations. In a great irony, their civilizing mission was a genocidal mission, and they spread nothing but disease. But I digress. It's an interesting relation between how the dragon has been portrayed and how the treatment in their mythology also relates to larger colonizing missions to the New World. And so this portrayal of the dragon even takes its root in the modern day. One of the more famous examples of the dragon is within Tolkien's Legendarium. When people think about Middle-earth, they think about these dragons that have been portrayed in the works of Tolkien, in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And more particularly in The Hobbit, Tolkien decides to deliberately revive the medieval European dragon traditions. Rather than trying to reinvent them, he plays on the old tropes. Smaug in The Hobbit is an intelligent, cruel, and deeply greedy creature. In the final chapter of the book, embodying these qualities with his game of riddles with Bilbo Baggins. Bilbo was trying to flatter in the final chapters of the book, was trying to flatter Smaug and to speak more towards his great qualities. And Smaug himself shows himself to be intelligent and not merely an animalistic creature, not aware of what he's doing. Smaug's actions throughout the book of The Hobbit destroyed two entire communities, the Dwarven Kingdom of Erebor as well as the Men of Dale, creating refugees in Lake Town and beyond in the Grey Mountains with the Dwarven communities. And it shows his greed as something that is socially catastrophic and having these implications beyond just him hoarding wealth and killing people. It has great effect on the societies. It is also further furthermore, it is worth exploring why dragons stay evil in European fantasy. And it's mainly because European fantasy continues to inherit medieval moral frameworks. Rather than reinventing the dragons are still used as final enemies, ultimate threats, or symbols of domination. And they're rarely allowed to be neutral or benevolent creatures because, following tradition, it frames them as moral opposites to humanity. And even when dragons are given intelligence, it's often in a negative manner to emphasize arrogance, cruelty, or tyranny, ultimately making them enemies of mankind rather than helpers or allies. Now, one thing that would really sort of grind my gears is to go throughout this whole video without mentioning the exception to the European portrayal quite largely, and that is the Welsh dragon. The dragon, as it was portrayed in Welsh culture and the Celtic culture more broadly, however, the Welsh culture is what survives, more particularly represents a subversion of this trope of the dragon in European culture. And that's the fact that dragons aren't really all evil. It functions as a symbol of identity, ancestry, and resistance for the Welsh people, rather than one of a monstrous figure. It's not something that they're really terrified of. Rather than that, they embrace it in their resistance to the English. And this is seen in the prophecy of the red and white dragon. The red and white dragon represent the Celtic people and the Anglo-Saxons, as well as their struggle with the invading Saxons, essentially wiping out the Celtic people. The prophecy clearly states that whilst the white dragon will be victorious and have their dominance over the Celtic people, the red dragon will eventually return and win against the white dragon. And about several centuries later, Henry Tudor would arrive on the English Isles as a descendant of the Welsh people and liberate them from Richard III. And his dynasty would mark a split from the Plantagenet people. And this dynasty would continue with the Stuarts and the Georgians and eventually our current ruling house of the Windsor Mountbattens. And so what the dragon can represent here is cultural struggle rather than moral evil, where the dragon is the proud symbol of the Welsh people, even to this day, where we can see it on the flag of the Welsh people. And what that essentially shows is that the European dragon can represent legitimacy and survival of a culture, rather than and more so than death and destruction. So, with regards to my concluding remarks, when we look across European history, dragons have consistently appeared as symbols rather than creatures. And they are shaped by not only religion, morality, but also ideas of power. And they can embody multiple things. The fear of chaos, corruption, and excess, but especially this power that exists outside human and moral control. And European societies frame the world through these strong binaries, as we can see in medieval Europe and beyond. Good versus evil, order versus disorder, faith versus temptation. And what dragons and these serpentine figures were placed firmly on the wrong side of each of these divides. And so the act of slaying these dragons and monsters would become more important than the creature itself. It reinforces these larger ideals of heroism, virtue, and moral authority. It even carries over to modern fantasy. European dragons rarely escape this typecasted role. They remain enemies, being the final bosses or apocalyptic threats that humanity faces. And what that can ultimately show us is that dragons are mirrors. They reflect the fears of a society, what the said society condemns, and what it must believe that it must overcome. Effectively, European dragons aren't evil because they're naturally monstrous, but because European storytelling needs a powerful symbol for everything defined as dangerous by said society. So it is worth asking ourselves that if dragons are shaped by this culture and not nature, then how might the dragons be portrayed in the future? And how might the future continue to reshape these stories? And what would that say about us as a society, I guess? And so with that, the video has come to an end. In next week, I hope to look at the portrayal of the dragon in Eastern Asian cultures, and also more broadly, globally as a whole. So ultimately, to end this podcast, I hope you've taken away something from it. I hope it's been informative and intriguing. Make sure to let me know down below what you think of it in the comment section. And make sure to like, share and subscribe. And good day to you.